to sort of give a bit of background to how we came to screen this film, first of all. We were originally going to screen a film called Grave of the Fireflies, which was about a couple of children's experience of the Second World War in Japan, and that we had a speaker lined up and everything, and I mean that in itself is a harrowing film too, but of a completely different nature. It's not a documentary. But we couldn't get a license to screen that, so we had to kind of cancel, and it was at fairly last minute that we decided to screen Waltz with Bashir. And that's kind of how I've given this talk. So I can't claim to be an expert on either the conflict in Lebanon or indeed the film itself. However, I've been working as a media lecturer for several years, analysing films with the help of my students. And there are a few points that I'd like to kind of raise as a starting point for discussion, and then we've got some microphones that we could hand around to the rest of you if anyone has got any points they'd like to raise, because there may be people in the room that are more knowledgeable about some of the issues raised than me. Just a bit of background. I mean, just before I start the talk, I need to say there's a need, obviously, for sensitivity in relation to what are real events. But there's also a need, from a media studies perspective, if you like, to analyse this as a form of media which has music, a structure, and a storytelling technique. So although it points to real events, it's still, to some extent, a construct. And it's not a trivial question in the face of even that, even the shocking images, to ask, how does it achieve its effects on the audience? Because the film, the animation, the documentary, whatever you want to call it, is more than a faithful reporting of events, and some have argued it's less than that too. There are a number of people that are very critical of the way that this film has portrayed certain events. So, but just firstly, a few words about how it was put together. It was made over a period of 4 years. You remember near the start, as the director character talks to the therapist and his first friend Bars in the bar. His friend Bars says, "Isn't film a form of therapy? Isn't filmmaking a form of therapy?" And I think to some extent it has been for the director. 4 years is a long time. They started with audio recordings, mainly of real people that were actually there. And then they did a storyboard mock-up, and then they re-recorded the interviews and used those as the basis for the actual structure of the piece. The visual style is sometimes confused with rotoscoping, where people draw over actual film. You might have seen it in films such as A Scanner Darkly, but it's not that. It's in fact made up of Flash cutouts. Now, Flash is a software package that is often used for simplistic animation for computer games, 3D software, and more traditional animation techniques, incorporating some photographs which they drew over. So that's kind of the material. There's a question about whether it's a factual film or a fictional film, and I'll explain why. There's clearly autobiographical elements to the film. It's about the director's experiences, and the characters appear as themselves. But to some extent, all media is fictionalized. This doesn't mean it's untrue, simply that it's been constructed around a narrative structure. So the word fact and fiction are not actually opposites. They both have the same root from the word, I think a Latin word, facere, which means to tell or to relate. So by constructing a story, you're not necessarily going in the opposite direction of the truth, whatever that might be. But it is very unusual to find a feature-length animation documentary. There's not many about. Last year we screened at this event a film called Restrepo, and it followed the experiences of a platoon in Kerangol Valley in Afghanistan. And the camera stayed exclusively with those troops, and you saw everything from the point of view of those troops. There was no additional music to the sound track. It was a faithful representation, or attempted to be a faithful representation of what those troops experienced. And for that reason, it was also criticised for failing to show the other side, if you like, adequately. But nonetheless, it raised questions about what we mean when we talk about media in relation to objectivity, because it claimed to be an objective account. Obviously, this film that we've just watched goes in a slightly different direction. It's not a balanced film. It's a film that comes from the experience of an Israeli soldier, and all the main characters are Israeli characters. So from that point of view, it's not balanced. But I don't know if that's inherently a problem, because it doesn't claim to be so. If it claims to be balanced, then maybe that would be a problem. So that the truth, perhaps, is something, you know, that we associate with aspirations rather than something we can concretely do in a media product. The media product will always be separate from the thing itself, thank goodness. The hinge, if you like, of the piece is towards the end, I think. I don't know if you'll agree, you'll have your own thoughts, but the moment where it shifts from animation to real footage is immensely powerful. Certainly it was for me. Shocking. Whereas the animation is dreamlike, divorced, calming, even beautiful, you know, if sad. And the music enhances it. So we have that waltz sequence, which is just bizarre, actually. There's a kind of divorcing that goes on from the actual horror of the conflict, and that's paralleled in elements of the storytelling. For example, when the director goes to visit his friend in Holland, his friend says, "You can draw me and my son, but you can't film us," as if there's some kind of violence that will be done to memory by the use of film. The video footage is rough, brutal, but it's still edited and selected to fit the narrative structure. So note there's a child amidst the rubble with curly hair. And remember, it's not reality, it's footage. It represents a reality, but it's still selected. And it's not churlish to remind ourselves of this. A film is a piece of media. The massacre was real. Neither the animation or the piece at the end could have achieved their shocking effect without the other. It would have been very difficult to sit through an hour and a half of footage like we saw at the end. We probably wouldn't do it. So one possible message of the film, which, I mean, the director himself has called this a fairly banal message, is just the general awfulness of war that we could take away. That's pretty clear, I think, from the film. There is as I described, a kind of disassociation that goes on through the animation, a separation from the actual events, which is mirrored in the narrative. So again, the director asks, is it possible that I can't remember such a dramatic event? And Professor Zahava Solomon within the film says we call them dissociative events. It's where a person is in a situation but feels outside it. He looked at everything, and this is talking about the character that witnesses the killing of the Arabian horses, and he's going through the war as if he's got an imaginary camera with him to shield himself from the reality. And she says his camera broke when he saw slaughtered Arabian horses. So that's a kind of reverse mirroring of what the director tries to do to us when he breaks the flow of the animation and just gives us that brutal footage at the end. The film really is as much about the war, it's about personal trauma and memory. And I mean, I don't necessarily share this point of view, but I'm just going to go through some of the reasons that the film has been quite heavily criticised, and then perhaps open it up to you for points and your thoughts. Some argue that this kind of trivialises the actual victims, you know, the victims of the massacre, because this is really about the experience of one soldier. The opening character, Boaz, talks about having to kill dogs. Further on through the film, another trauma seems to be killing horses. But humans seem to be kind of at the end of that list. So the broken lens, that metaphorical thing, is actually foreshadowing what we see later on. So the question I have is, how responsible is Folman, the director, as a naive, conscripted 19-year-old for what actually happened? Is this film just a way of him kind of having therapy for the guilt that he feels? Does it actually deal with what happened? Or is it just a kind of therapy that we can kind of watch, almost as a piece of entertainment? That might sound harsh. Surprisingly, perhaps, the film was actually well promoted, and the distribution of it wasn't hindered by the Israeli authorities, even though it seems to reflect very badly on the Israeli Defense Forces and what happened. Conversely, the film is actually banned in Lebanon, where the massacre took place, and although there's been some selective screenings and pirated copies are widely available, officially it's banned. I think it's instructive to ask why that is. Speaking of the Israeli backing for the film, Folman thinks they did that deliberately. I think they realised that the more I criticise what happened, the more Israel is shown as a very tolerant country, so that by allowing this kind of freedom of expression, they're shown to be tolerant, liberal, westernised. So now just a few critical quotes. This was from an article which I found online, but I couldn't unfortunately find the actual author's name, but there's the link. I'll put these notes actually up on the Media and Conflict website, which is mediaandconflict.co.uk if you want to follow any of these up. One way the film distorts the truth is that it implies that the killing took place over the course of one night. It's not hard to understand why the filmmaker felt the need to compress the events so as to maximise the impact, but his solution isn't good. It makes a difference when you know that the massacre went on not just for a night, but for more than 38 hours. The Israeli leadership didn't just waltz with Bashir, it first deliberately inflamed and then brought in the Falangist militia to carry out the killings. So this author's arguing that the film absolves the authorities of some of that guilt. This is also a rather harsh quote. While the Israelis are drawn as two-dimensional cartoon figures, the Palestinians are the only ones shown as real human beings in actual film footage, in an attempt, seemingly, to hammer home the point that war is no American action movie, and that the true victims were the refugees in the camps. This final scene is, in fact, Waltz with Bashir's ultimate assault on the Palestinians. They only feature as massacred and bloated body parts, as symbols for Israelis' guilt. Pretty harsh. This is a quote from Robert Fisk, who was one of the first journalists to arrive at the scene, and he's written incredibly powerfully actually about this and other massacres. The guilty were certainly Christian militiamen, from which particular unit we were still unsure, but the Israelis were also guilty. If the Israelis had not taken part in the killings, they had certainly sent militia into the camp. They had trained them, given them uniforms, handed them US Army rations and Israeli medical equipment. Then they had watched the murderers in the camps. They had given them military assistance. They had the Israeli Air Force had dropped all those flares to help the men who were murdering the inhabitants. So those were the flares that the central character was actually firing in the film. And they established military liaison with the murderers in the camp. So the previous two quotes particularly are arguing that despite how terrible the film shows the war to have been, it isn't actually harsh enough in relation to what the Israeli occupying force did at that point. However, I don't, honestly speaking, know enough about the situation to have an opinion either way. I just thought I'd raise those as possible talking points. And I'd like to, if anyone wanted to make any points or ask any questions at this point, just hand over to people. There's roaming microphones, so if you could wait for one of them to get to you before you ask a question, that'd be good.
It was really useful actually to have that recap before we start talking, because it kind of puts the film for us to see in the perspective of a piece of work done by one person about his experiences. And you know, as a fictionalised account of his real experiences, I think it's quite interesting. I think it's interesting that it exists for us to discuss and for people to respond. And from that point of view alone, I think it's really successful. It's a piece of media that somebody has obviously spent a long time thinking about and exploring, and I think he uses some very interesting techniques. I think from the point of view of that whole dislocation and distancing and the way that animation is used, I think that's a really interesting point to bring up. And I think also for us the point is to be able to put it into that environment where we can discuss how people have also discussed it afterwards, because obviously this is one filmmaker, and it's really important that we hear the discussion that other people have in response, who may have just as equally real experiences of that situation. So I think that was the point I wanted to make there.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it's hard to argue with the skill of the filmmaker in terms of telling us and telling the story and allowing that space.
Israeli government, they allowed this just because it was the Christians who were shown as the bad guys, and Israeli, they were shown on the neutral side, and could it be that now because the Israeli government want to show itself as an open to criticism, but the fact that it was that Christians were shown as the bad guys and not Jews.
I think that's one of the criticisms that some of those quotes suggested, or elsewhere in the articles where those quotes are from. It suggests that the film implies that the Israeli soldiers were somehow innocent or just naive and didn't know what was going on, and that it was the Christian militias that had carried everything out, and that was one of the criticisms that came up. I mean, I'm not sure if I agree entirely, because I think there is, if everything in this film is about guilt, it seems to me, there's a huge amount of guilt that seems to come across, but whether guilt is enough is perhaps the question. Whether it's all, whether that somehow absolves you.
Yeah, I'd be very curious to hear an interpretation purely from a Palestinian perspective, because it seems to me that this could just be like a detail, a very kind of extraordinary and very tragic detail in quite a long history of difficulties between, that's an understatement, difficulties between Israel and Palestine. And I'd just like to, I just wonder if there's an opinion directly from a Palestinian perspective as part of the history of that conflict.
Is there anyone here that has maybe more direct experience or any thoughts? Or, yeah, there's a chap there with it.
I wanted to refrain from participating in a discussion because the simple reason I'm here is to learn. You're a professor, I'm a war veteran.
I think we're here to learn from you in that case.
But I just couldn't, again, not intervene because as the gentleman said, unless you go back to history, the Balfour Declaration and the American intervention, Yom Kippur, Six-Day War, one simply cannot put this particular film into context. And I have to congratulate you for the way in which you tread on a very slippery path, banana skin almost, to deal with such an emotive issue. And the film, for what has particular significance to me, would be interesting if there were people from the Irish conflict here. Because people assume armchair theatre is one thing, and being in the front line is a totally different proposition, believe you me. So much so that I thought I didn't read the write-up beforehand. Am I speaking loud enough? Sorry? Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. But somehow, right from the very beginning, I got the impression the filmmaker was a war veteran himself, and he was talking from a very privileged and vantage position, and that confirmed itself along the line. One doesn't forget. One cannot have partial amnesia, but we choose to forget. Unfortunately, we cannot. I cannot. None of the Irish veterans who are here can ever forget. The theatre of war, sir, is nothing to do at all with what we read on a daily basis. Therefore, I've got to congratulate you, and I think your students are very privileged in understanding how important it is not to make rash judgment and appreciation of such complex issues. If I do come to your workshop, I would like to add to a few practical things that could help promote the discussion and put the discussion further. One of those issues, if I'm allowed to, will be the involvement of the American, not just the British and Lord Balfour, but the American. Because to my mind, cruel as it may be, I'm not trying to exonerate the Jewish people, the Jewish nation. Maybe Zionism, yes, but I personally believe the Israelis are fighting a war by proxy. And the word America has only been mentioned 2 or 3 times in the film. So, therefore, I'm sorry if I've added to confusion, but I'm also as baffled as you are, and as most serious people treating this issue is. We cannot afford to get emotive and start making rash judgment and inordinately biased opinions and appreciation. One has to really do big detail. And hopefully, if I can come to your workshop, I will give you a few details that I know personally from a different war, the Algerian War, which you think Battle of Algiers, I dare say.
Yes, but we screened it last year actually about Algiers.
I can assure you, sir, there will be 10 other films made after the Battle of Algiers, because I'm not saying it didn't bear relation to reality, but some of the things that have happened over there have not featured in the newspaper and the media at all. And you be prepared, therefore, the young generation today, in 10, 20, 30 times, years' time to hear, you'll be shocked about what happened in Algeria. And at this moment, I think because I've had the microphone for too long. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very helpful contribution, and I do think not jumping to conclusions is a very good piece of advice. Okay, well, thanks very much for attending, and I hope you found it useful. And I just mentioned tomorrow that there's this is working. There's one more screening tomorrow, which is the South America with Eyes Wide Open, which is a documentary about various struggles in South America, with quite an optimistic point of view, actually, looking at some of the modern leaders that are there and how they might be changing things. I hope to see you tomorrow. Thanks.